Mattison, who is a Los Angeles-based artist who handcrafts large-scale ceramic sculpture works that are inspired by the fragile beauty of coral reefs and the human-caused threats they face, particularly climate change. Her work has been featured by international outlets, including Smithsonian Magazine, Good Morning America, Oprah Magazine, CNN Indonesia, BBC World Service, and Science Magazine. Today, Courtney will talk about her art in the context of using art to advocate for environmental conservation. Without further ado, Courtney, take it away.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you all for having me. I'll start out with a video that kind of gives a good little intro to my work, and then I'll go into a more detailed presentation. So here we go. I remember first exploring the ocean as a kid. It always really fascinated me that there was this other world right in our backyards that people paid so little attention to. After I had started studying marine biology, I finally got scuba certified. I remember just having this epiphany. Nature is so much more creative than I could ever be. I'm Courtney Mattison. I'm an artist and ocean advocate. I feel so lucky to have been invited by Oceanic Society to visit Raja Ampat now and see one of the last really healthy coral reef ecosystems on our planet. The first thing that people often don't realize is that corals are animals. They live in colonies of hundreds or thousands of individuals all on one piece that looks like a rock. Coral reefs cover less than 0.1% of the seafloor, but they actually support 25% of life in the ocean. But now, coral reefs are at a tipping point.
Yeah, so you told me a story when we first talked about you having spent time in Australia.
In 2007, I spent a lot of time out on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was really, really beautiful. It seemed like it was a very healthy reef. I was so touched by that experience that 9 years later, I wanted to bring my husband back to those same reefs and show him. We descended down onto the reef and started exploring. And then I remember turning the corner, and as we looked beyond it, we saw a thicket of staghorn corals as far as we could see. And every single one of them was ghostly white. It's taken 10,000 years for coral reefs to grow into the ecosystems that they are today. And only in the last 50 years, we've lost half of them. Seeing bleaching like that changed everything for me because I could actually visualize climate change. Combining science and art is a powerful way to represent the fact that coral reefs are at a turning point. When I design a work, I start with a sketch. It's a combination of real-life inspiration and a conceptual background. Ultimately, creating a gigantic wall relief can take 8 months to a year. I think of my work as building monuments to coral reefs in celebration of their beauty and their fragility and their value. When someone looks at one of my works, I hope that they'll be kind of seduced by the colorful, healthy corals at the heart of the swirl. And then I hope they'll stand back and realize what's happening. I hope it will spark a sense of caring in viewers enough to protect them. I think that's part of why I admire corals so much, because I think it's a metaphor. Even one tiny little human in the world can make a gigantic difference if they focus their efforts.
Kita sabar menanti Siwalenyong sampai mati.
All right. Hopefully that transported you to warmer places. I'm based in Los Angeles, so I shouldn't talk. It's warm here, but anyway. I'll talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can do kind of a Q&A conversation at the end. So save questions or put them in the chat, or feel free to interrupt if something is urgent and you have a burning question. But I'll just sort of go through kind of the story of my work and what inspires it. The main focus of all of my work, starting all the way back when I was a high school student in San Francisco, is protecting the ocean. Life on Earth wouldn't be possible without water, and water is what we look for when we're searching for other planets that are as hospitable as Earth is to life. There's a renowned oceanographer and National Geographic Society explorer in residence named Dr. Sylvia Earle, who says, "No water, no life, no blue, no green." And I really like that. I think it's a good way to kind of point out that connection. And she's also fond of saying that without water, we'd have a planet a lot like Mars. The ocean, which covers over 70% of Earth's surface, connects us all, from the deep mesophotic coral reefs of the Philippines to the icy peaks of the Rocky Mountains. And because we're all connected to the ocean, our actions, the carbon dioxide we emit, the materials we waste, the fish we eat, all have an impact on it, no matter where these actions occur. And I deeply believe that art can help shape our path towards more wholehearted actions and policies for marine conservation. So I combine my backgrounds in marine conservation biology and ceramic sculpture to try to inspire social change, policy change, and translate concepts from environmental science into aesthetically stimulating forms and sculptural installations. Two of my largest works to date are in Indonesia and are inspired by that country's magnificent coral reefs. Coral reefs have really captivated my imagination for as long as I can remember, and I'm happiest when the exotic forms and delicate appendages, and often venomous appendages of animals that inhabit a tropical coral reef kind of dance through the window of my scuba mask as I slowly hover above. Or in this case, behind. That's a gigantic Napoleon wrasse named Wally, who I met on the Great Barrier Reef. I love coral reefs for the mysteries that they hold and for the tiny plant-like animals that are some of the faceless architects of some of the world's largest living things. And I feel a deep connection to Indonesia's coral reefs in particular, because I've spent the last few years exploring them, diving, like in that video, in Raja Ampat in eastern Indonesia, and also Komodo, Alor, and Bali, among some other places. And the beauty of these reefs lies in the diversity of their species. the corals, anemones, and other invertebrates are sort of competing for light and resources in this beautiful dance that makes them really sculptural, I think. And the reefs of Indonesia are more diverse and healthy than almost anywhere else on the planet. Indonesia lies at the heart of a gigantic region called the Coral Triangle, which is famous for having the highest biodiversity, the highest number of species of any marine area on Earth. So scientists often refer to it as the Amazon rainforest of the sea. And these reefs are also very important because they provide food and coastal protection and tourism dollars and other value to the people that directly depend on them for survival. Corals are so sensitive, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Corals are suffering from a phenomenon called bleaching, which is due to kind of an immune response that happens from the slightest change in the temperature of the water that surrounds them. Coral bleaching essentially is like the corals have a fever and they start ejecting the symbiotic algae that live inside their tissue that photosynthesize and give them a really important food source that they need to survive. And of course, this warming sea temperature is caused by climate change and often in conjunction with an El Nino event that makes the water extra warm. So there have been more frequent periodic bleaching events combined with warm water events in recent years, including in 2020, actually. Corals stressed by warming sea temperatures lose those symbiotic algae and they essentially begin to starve and also become really susceptible to disease. So a lot of times corals affected by bleaching do end up dying, but I should note that they can actually recover from bleaching if the stressor reduces quickly enough. But if the stressor isn't reduced and the water stays too warm and the reef does die, it can cause widespread devastation. It really is sort of like a city going bankrupt and letting its buildings fall apart. Another major issue for ocean health is the acidification of seawater, which occurs when carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean, forms carbonic acid, and releases hydrogen ions that keep corals and other shell-building organisms from precipitating the calcium carbonate they need to construct their stony structures and build coral reefs. Overfishing is also a huge issue for marine health. And if you've seen the film Seacology, you'll know all about that. That just came out on Netflix. 90% of the big predatory fish like tuna, cod, swordfish, and sharks are already removed from the ocean by commercial fisheries. And having fewer big predatory fish at the top of the food chain can allow their prey fish, the herbivorous ones, to multiply out of control. But that often isn't even the issue because the prey fish are being removed at an unsustainable rate also, which means that there are fewer grazers clearing patches of algae on the reef for baby corals to settle and grow and rebuild the reef. So it's all connected. Land-based sources of pollution full of chemicals, sewage, fertilizer, and pesticides from farms, golf courses, and other developed areas, both coastal and upstream, pose another major threat to marine life that cause dead zones like in the Gulf of Mexico. Overfishing and pollution combined can really cause too much algae to grow on the reefs, and it can essentially smother the corals and prevent those baby corals from regrowing the reef. So this is a photo I took of some of that happening on a reef in West Palm Beach in Florida a few years ago. It was pretty nasty. It looked like a golf course. And then of course, plastic pollution is another really popular issue right now that is forming giant garbage patches in the ocean and causing widespread devastation also. We have a lot to lose if coral reefs crash. There was a 2014 study by Robert Costanza that found that coral reefs are worth $11 trillion worldwide. So they're extremely valuable through like tourism dollars, coastline protection, and all kinds of other resources. Without our help to eliminate the pressures that we put on reefs, Leading researchers predict that nearly 100% of coral reefs will be in a rapid and terminal decline by 2050, within the next 30 years, and may lose their ecological functionality by the end of this century or sooner. And I know that sounds very doom and gloom, and that's not helpful in terms of inspiring conservation. But there is hope, and we may still be able to turn things around for coral reefs. So there was a 2018 study in the journal Nature Climate Change that suggested that there are some species of kind of more robust, resilient corals that can handle warmer temperatures and higher acidity and may be able to kind of repopulate the reef if we do enough to kind of curb our emissions, mitigate climate change, and those other threats that I mentioned. Through my artwork, my goal is to highlight these facts while empowering viewers to feel hopeful and act while we still can. Sorry about my dog barking. Art can go beyond showing us scientific evidence or revealing an environmental problem. It can make us care and act to protect. The first time we saw a photograph of Earth from space sparked this kind of feeling, an understanding of our home, our connectedness, and how tiny, fragile, and special life really is. We protect what we care about, and we care about what we know and understand. Art can inspire social change and shape how we understand environmental issues. And art can translate scientific concepts and shape how we understand them. Historically, people took for granted how interrelated art and science are. And the Renaissance period is probably the best example of that, with Leonardo da Vinci and other polymaths kind of combining art and science in order to better understand what they were studying. So da Vinci's sketches of human anatomy and nature and engineering in terms of physics really got him, he's known as a famous master artist, but he was a really father of modern science also. And one could argue that creativity and experimentation that sprung from combining art and science during the Renaissance led to many of the major scientific advancements of the time. I think there are contemporary examples too, and artists that I really admire, like Maya Lin, are using data to kind of interpret scientific research into these really aesthetically amazing forms that can be architectural scale. This is a work called Waterline that she did in 2006 that traces the bathymetry, a topographic seascape of the South Atlantic Ocean near Antarctica. Art can impact our emotions. You may have seen the poppies at the Tower of London. This was a really powerful work as well. And art can form personal connections and build community. Art and science are two ways in which humanity explores and explains the world. Dr. Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman to travel in space, puts it this way: the difference between science and the arts is not that they are different sides of the same coin even, or even different parts of the same continuum, but rather they are manifestations of the same thing. The arts and sciences are avatars of human creativity. Not all artists care about science and vice versa, and that's fine, but both artists and scientists use creativity to come up with solutions to questions about the world, often developing meticulous techniques to achieve answers to these questions. So with that belief, I've formed a career as an artist and an ocean advocate to bring awareness to the threats to ocean health and bring them kind of above the surface and into view for people. So this is a photo of me putting the finishing touches on my very first large-scale ceramic sculptural coral reef installation called Our Changing Seas, A Coral Reef Story in Washington, D.C. This work was the culmination of my master's thesis in environmental studies at Brown University, where I combined coursework in marine conservation science and policy with coursework in the ceramics department, along with a thesis co-advisor at the Rhode Island School of Design, kind of down the street. So this work, I got permission to debut it in the lobby of the Herbert C. Hoover building. which is the headquarters for the US Department of Commerce and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And as a master's candidate in environmental studies, this was back 2009 to 2011, I interviewed marine researchers and artists about the potential for art to inspire coral reef conservation. And when I was taking classes at the Rhode Island School of Design, I also rented a studio in downtown Providence, Rhode Island, where I kind of amassed this giant collection of crazy corals that I sculpted and then figured out how to assemble into this installation I made. I knew going into this project that I wanted to create a masterpiece, but I really didn't know what that meant. I wanted it to be visually stunning, and I wanted it to kind of transform a human-made environment and just catch people's attention. And I had no idea if I could achieve that, but I basically ended up using my interview results to inform the design of the work that I made. And I started building. I got permission to install the work in the lobby of the Department of Commerce, which of course has beautiful marble walls that are very historic and you're not allowed to touch them. So I ended up engineering this gigantic, crazy counterweighted structure that could support the installation. And then my poor boyfriend at the time, now husband, would come over and help me install these pieces, and we did sort of a test installation in my studio. So this was probably the only panel of all 24 that he could actually hang by himself because they were so heavy and huge. And so then we finally completed it. We had a kind of preview party in my studio, and it ended up being about 15 feet tall by 11 feet wide and nearly 1,500 pounds of ceramic coral that I built. The next day, we took it all down and packed it into boxes and shipped it to Washington, D.C. And Thad and one of my other friends from Brown helped me install it over the course of a few days in the Commerce Department building. And then I did lots of finishing touches once it was mostly up. And this is the work when it was finished. At eye level, I really wanted to kind of celebrate the exotic forms of coral reef flora and fauna in concert with their biological complexity and diversity. So I wanted to kind of seduce people in and then have them stand back and realize that the reef was transitioning from healthy and diverse to sickened and bleached, and then up into a kind of post-bleached dead reef, essentially, that's covered in algae. But there's kind of a red coral at the top right corner that's supposed to be kind of a sense of hope for recovery. I mentioned the Department of Commerce doubles as the headquarters for NOAA, and the administrator of NOAA at the time was Dr. Jane Lubchenco, who was recently designated as President Biden's Deputy Director for Climate and the Environment in the White House. So she was a great advocate for this project, and I'm really grateful to her for joining in the opening reception and then also connecting me with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also in Washington, D.C., and this is where the work is installed today. It's still there. So the lobby of AAAS, which publishes Science magazine. The Our Changing Seas series that I started with that first work, I'm continuing it to this day, and it's changed a lot over the last 10 years. I'm currently completing my 7th work in the series for a new hotel called the Seabird, which will be in Oceanside, California, which is close to San Diego. And my goal for all of these works in this series is really to kind of inspire conservation, but like form a personal connection for people. And I think in 2014 with Our Changing Seas 3, this work was the first where I really tossed coral reefs up into the air and gave them this sort of sense of anti-gravity. And this is the work that's actually behind me here in my studio right now. It's been sort of a flagship work for me. I think using the hurricane spiral motif is powerful because I can put coral, like the really healthy, diverse, kind of idealized corals at the heart or the eye of the storm, and then have the swirling skeletons of bleached corals kind of rotating around them. So I think that imagery is powerful. I think I want people to interpret it for themselves. Since coral reefs can recover from bleaching, I don't want the work to just be completely pessimistic. I think you can interpret it either direction because coral reefs really are at a turning point and their future is in our hands. It's up in the air. So you can really interpret it optimistically or pessimistically. And Our Changing Seas 3 has toured around the country for a bit since I completed it. So I'm thrilled at how many people have seen it in person, and especially school groups. Like, I love when kids get to see the work and kind of come up with all kinds of crazy ideas about what it means. I'll show you a little bit about my design process. This is a really rough sketch of what I wanted to create before I started building it. But I always start with a sketch. Now my sketches are a little bit more sophisticated, which I'll show you later. But once I have my initial design, I create a map on the floor of my studio. It's sort of like a big three-dimensional puzzle, and I build all the pieces in relation to one another. And with this work, I really wanted to convey a sense of swirling, floating motion. So I built each piece in relation to one another, kind of working from inside out. I coil build hollow forms. So most of the forms that you can see behind me and in this kind of funny old photo are hollow. And so they're lightweight enough to hang on the wall safely. And the clay that I use is really great. I can do almost anything with it. So I build everything by hand. I don't use any molds. I use really simple tools like chopsticks and paintbrushes to sculpt and texture each piece. And I think the beauty, as I mentioned before, is in the diversity. And so I've just had to experiment with tons of different textures and tools to make a huge diversity of different species or kind of like hybrid species that I've invented. I don't focus too much on being completely realistic. In the ocean, coral polyps precipitate calcium carbonate from seawater to form their stony skeletons and essentially sculpt the reef. So I think that chemical parallel is really important in my work because calcium carbonate happens to also be a common ingredient in a lot of the glazes that I use. And you can imagine porcelain anemone tentacles are also extremely fragile. So having that shared sense of fragility is important too, because when you're diving on a living coral reef, you can kill the coral animals very easily by touching them. And so that's why it feels really essential that the medium of my work be ceramic. So once the individual pieces were glazed, I would kind of reassemble them and make sure everything fit together well. This is my big floor map. This is in my old studio in Denver. I lived in Denver, Colorado for 5 years and sculpted coral reefs a mile above sea level. But now I'm based in Los Angeles. Once all the pieces are finished, I put them into these crazy crates and then they can ship all over. So this is when we were installing the work at the Tang Museum at Skidmore College in 2014. That was the debut exhibition for Our Changing Seas 3. And then this is 2016 at the Palo Alto Art Center. Our Changing Seas 4, I completed as a commission, a private commission for a collector in Oregon. And I started working on it before I moved here to LA. So I started working on it while I was still in Denver. And then I finished it out here in 2019 when I was a resident artist at the Lux Art Institute near San Diego. So this is me standing in front of it for scale. It's about 17 by 11 feet. And then in 2020, last year on Earth Day, the United Nations Postal Administration requested to use images of this work on a stamp to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So I was excited about that. The design process for this work is a little bit more sophisticated than what I showed you before. So I did a hand-drawn sketch again, but I designed it all to scale to begin with. And then I put it into Photoshop to make my installation map. And then I kind of cut out these paper footprints to put on the grid on my floor so that everything would be measured really meticulously. And as you can see, I just love to work big. I think that the idea of one small person creating such huge, complex installations hopefully draws people's attention to how important coral reefs are to me, and then makes them kind of question how coral reefs are important to them and sort of spark that sense of curiosity. And I also often say that I enjoy feeling like a coral, just sort of quietly, methodically sculpting these tiny little things that eventually amass into gigantic kind of structures that can change an ecosystem. So again, we reassembled the pieces once they were glazed. This is Thad, my husband, who helped me way back, 12 years ago. So he's still around, happy to help, excuse me. And when I got the work shipped out to LA and to the Lux Art Institute, where I did my residency, I put up all the main core pieces on the wall. And then I was able to photograph those pieces and overlay them into Photoshop onto my sketch so that I could actually see what pieces were missing. So all the hand-drawn branches, I could see exactly where they fit in. And then I put tracing paper on the wall and actually drew them full scale onto the wall. So that was a new trick that I figured out that has helped me ever since. And so this is just some detail of the finished work once all those branches and tiny little pieces were finished. There's 350 tiny little pieces that all stick onto the wall around the core ones. Our Changing Seas 5 is called Confluence. That's this work. It's the largest one I've done yet. And I installed it in October 2018 as part of the permanent collection of the US Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia. And that was a commission for the US State Department's Office of Art and Embassies that was curated by Virginia Shore and Claire D'Alba. So it's absolutely enormous. This is me sitting under it for scale. It's 404 individual pieces, and it stands about 28 feet tall and over 18 feet wide, so really huge. And I designed it in a similar way to the other works I showed you before. And this time I was able to overlay my sketch onto an architectural rendering of the space that the contractor team gave me from the embassy. And then I created my grid again, and this is my really crazy measurement grid. So I knew exactly where every single piece was going to be on the wall before I started building and how the hardware was going to attach. And then I built the work on the floor of my studio where I'm sitting right now. And the floor in here is only big enough to fit about half of the installation at a time. So I had to create it in 2 different phases. So I started with the bottom half and then did the second half afterwards. And I had help from one assistant, one amazing saint assistant, and sometimes even my mom and Thad, my husband, would come help, but I did a lot of it myself. And it was just a really gigantic, fun, crazy project. So this is when all the pieces were coming together after I glazed, and then we got a great art handling company to come in and pack everything for the big trip to Indonesia. And then I had a small team of art handlers help me install the work over the course of about 9 days at the embassy. And it was pretty fun because we had tandem scissor lifts, and so there were lots of logistics to deal with. And there's a catwalk that goes across kind of the top portion of the work, so people would come out of the cafeteria and start talking to us while we were on the scissor lifts and distract us, but it was pretty fun. There are Marines that run the building, and so they would they liked joking around and coming up and asking if it was a climbing wall that we were building for them, but hopefully eventually they got the point. And this is a detail shot. This is a work, I'll show you some other works that I've done aside from my Art Changing Seas series. This is a work called Malum Geminis that I finished in 2019. And it was to debut at the Fragile Earth exhibition I did at the Florence Griswold Museum in Connecticut, which is curated by Jenny Parsons. Malum Geminis means evil twins in Latin, and it's a reference to Dr. Jane Lubchenco's 2009 statement at the Copenhagen Climate Summit that ocean acidification is like the equally evil twin of climate change when it comes to coral reefs. So I did sort of this fractal design that was book matched to kind of think about those two equally evil twins. And then there are clusters of gelatinous white polyps that kind of appear to have had their supportive structures dissolved by acidic seawater. And there's another quote of Dr. Lubchenco's that says that ocean acidification is like osteoporosis of the sea. So I thought that was really powerful also. This is a gallery shot during Fragile Earth at the Florence Griswold Museum. And it's actually going to be touring, so it'll be at the Brandywine River Museum of Art in Pennsylvania next summer. Or fall 2022, excuse me. Everything keeps getting postponed. And here's a shot of me building the work for Fragile Earth in my studio. So you can kind of see how I lay everything out. This is another work I completed for Fragile Earth. It's kind of crazy looking, but this is called Texture Study 1, and it's essentially kind of an exploration of what the seafloor might look like if a kind of made up species of invasive tube sponge took over and there was no biodiversity left in sort of a post-mass extinction future. So I got a little bit out there with this one. This is another kind of playful work that I did back in 2016 for a solo show that I had at the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art. This one's called Aqueduct, and it explores what would happen if, in kind of a playful way, what would happen if sea level rise and species migration caused tropical reef species to kind of migrate away towards the poles into kind of human spaces and invade our dry spaces. And so this is corals kind of creeping through an air duct register that I hand carved from porcelain. And here's a detail shot of that one. Another series that I've been playing with is called Fossil Fuels, which is a pretty literal translation, but obviously about the impacts of fossil fuel use on coral bleaching. And this was a fun way for me to experiment with creating some more man-made looking objects. So still all hand carved the same way, just kind of branching out in that regard. And then in 2018, that was a big year. That was also when I completed working on this project for the Coral Triangle Center in Bali. This is called Semesta Terumbu Karang, which means coral universe in Indonesian. And they invited me to come out. They were working with an international team of architects and exhibit designers and artists and donors and nonprofits to create the CTC Center for Marine Conservation in Sanur, Bali, to serve as kind of an educational center for local and tourist visitors. So back in 2016, they invited me to come down and start talking to them about possibly creating a work that would be kind of a emotional or inspiring kind of heart for the center to get people excited about conservation. And I'm really proud to have been part of this project. I visited Bali 5 times in the past few years, from 2016 to 2018, to lead workshops and do glazing workshops and kind of teach some of my techniques to local artists who could then teach them to groups of other people. And so we got over 300 people involved in creating this work. We had a kind of core team of artists, and then they would get volunteers and scientists and artists and all kinds of other people from different backgrounds to get involved. And this was during the anemone making workshop. This is some of the pieces before they were glazed. And then we also were fortunate to have a local ceramic like tableware factory contribute a lot of resources and time to this project. So they ended up making about half of the pieces with their artists. And so this was me when I was picking out glaze colors. And these are some of the anemones and other volunteer made pieces once they were glazed and ready for installation. And then back in September 2018, we had everything ready. And so we laid everything out in this kind of, I think it was actually a refugee tent at the Coral Triangle Center. And we began kind of sorting everything and installing. And it took 12 full days to install this project. It was over 2,000 individual pieces that had to attach to the wall one at a time. So we had kind of our lead local artist, who's an Indonesian guy named Rico Gabriel, who was really helpful. And then we got a few other kind of construction workers and other guys to kind of help us install everything. But it was a masonry wall. So attaching each piece with hardware and epoxy was a pretty involved process. And some of the artists came out and other people that had been involved in creating pieces for the project. So we had a good team. These are just some detail shots of where all the pieces were marked out before they were attached. And it was a really laborious process, but I think everyone was really proud of what we came up with. So. And the design essentially is it kind of represents the 6 different countries of the Coral Triangle. So in addition to Indonesia, it's the Philippines, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, East Timor, and the Solomon Islands. And then there's kind of a central bullseye that represents the kind of bullseye of biodiversity for the ocean in the Coral Triangle. And we had a big celebration to unveil the work. So this was during the Our Ocean Conference in 2018, which just happened to be in Bali. So we decided to unveil it then. And we had a traditional Balinese dancer ceremony, and then we all got to play these crazy instruments, and representatives from Indonesia, Monaco, and Australia signed a accord uniting to protect coral reefs, and an initiative that's still ongoing. And then I did a press conference with CNN Indonesia with the ambassador for Indonesia from the US, who came out for the conference and attended the unveiling. And so it was cool because we could talk about how this work could be used as a tool to kind of unite the 2 countries and really galvanize support for grassroots conservation efforts. And so the workshops that we did to create the pieces for this installation really have snowballed into a whole offshoot. And so the Coral Triangle Center still operates these workshops. I think they went virtual for COVID, but they're kind of reopening these days, it looks like. So I think they're still hosting workshops. And I was back there in October 2019. And so I got to host this one and had fun meeting some people. And then I was invited to go with the US Embassy in Jakarta and also the consulate in a city called Surabaya to go to different universities and high schools around Indonesia and do workshops with students. So over the course of about 3 hours, we would each sculpt our own little coral reef assemblage. And it was a great way to kind of start conversations about what corals are, why they're so important, how beautiful they are, why it's so worth protecting. And like a lot of students in Indonesia don't know how to swim, or they don't necessarily have like an upbringing that involves exploring the ocean. And so it was a really great way to kind of start conversations about that. And everyone seemed really proud of their pieces. So it was a lot of fun. And then we went back to the embassy in Jakarta and did a presentation with some fisheries students at a government university, and then did an event with the ambassador. And the trip concluded with a visit out to a place called Alor Island, which is in eastern Indonesia, which has some of the most beautiful coral reefs I've ever seen in my life. And these kids are so lucky to have them right in their backyard. And so I'll close with one last kind of initiative that I work with. There's, I mentioned Sylvia Earle at the beginning. She's been a great mentor for me, and I work with her organization called Mission Blue, which is based in Northern California, which she founded when she won the TED Prize in 2009. And so when you win the TED Prize, you get to make a wish. And her wish is, I wish you would use all means at your disposal, films, the web, expeditions, new submarines, a campaign, to ignite public support for a network of global marine protected areas, hope spots large enough to save and restore the ocean, the blue heart of the planet. So I've taken that to heart and kind of try to do everything at my disposal to raise awareness about conservation and use my kind of unusual combination of skills and passion and marine science and art to raise awareness in that way. That's just sort of how I feel most vocal and how I can make the most unique difference through my work. And so I've even created a series of sculptural vignettes inspired by different hope spots. So this one is the Coral Triangle. This is the Coral Sea off the coast of Australia, which includes the Great Barrier Reef. Not all hope spots are coral reefs, just some of my favorite ones. So some of them are more abstract. This is the Charlie Gibbs Fracture Zone, which is a really deep sea trench near the Azores that there aren't many photos of. So I had to be a little bit more liberal with that. This is the Sargasso Sea. So that's a place off the coast of, or it's in the North Atlantic Ocean. I believe it's off the coast of Bermuda. But there are swirling gyres of sargassum seaweed that's sort of like a rainforest of seaweed in the water. And it creates these kind of floating reefs that are really important for juvenile fish and other species. And then back to coral, this is the Micronesian islands, which include small island nations like Palau and Marshall Islands and Guam. And I think the idea that we can all uniquely do what we can to help protect and restore the ocean is a really powerful one. So it's about raising awareness and inspiring action. And for me, I do that by creating art, and I still feel like I'm just getting started. And I hope that my work has even more potential to grow and change and inspire growing levels of support for curbing climate change and protecting the ocean. So I'll just ask kind of, what will you choose to do? And I'm happy to answer questions if you guys want to have kind of a conversation, or let me know.
Feel free to unmute yourself or ask a question in the chat, or you could direct message me and I will ask the question. But while just to give people time to think, I just wanted to say, we were talking about this before everyone arrived, but for those of you who didn't realize, that's a real sculpture behind her. I thought it was just a background, but that's her actual work. Which one is that?
This one's Art Changing Seas 3. Yeah, it's sort of a special piece for me because it was sort of a breakthrough with the design when it's like the first one I did that really had that swirling kind of hurricane spiral. So I'm pretty precious about it. So I decided I wasn't showing it as much because I'm afraid of touring it around too much. And so I decided to install it in my studio. So it's been kind of a fun thing to at least use as a backdrop, if nothing else.
So there's a question in the chat that I can read out. If you were able to point to one specific thing humans could do to make the most difference for the ocean, what would you pick?
I think climate change is the issue that looms most large in my mind. I think the combination of threats that humans are kind of putting on the ocean are the most important thing to think about, because it's that concert of different pressures that is really threatening things. But climate change is something that we need to work to solve most urgently, and it's going to take the most work to actually do that, I think. So I don't know, I think in terms of individual actions, climate change can often feel too big of an issue to solve by yourself, and it is. Everyone has to work together, and I think we need to recognize that. And voting and where you spend your money are two of the most important things you can do. I think you can choose to limit your intake of animal protein. You can choose to spend money at places that support renewable energy. You can vote for policymakers that believe in climate change and want to act urgently to resolve a lot of those contributing factors that are causing climate change. So I don't think it is just one thing. I think it's a combination. It's a lifestyle.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I absolutely love your work. I think you're incredibly talented.
Thank you.
Have you thought about in the future, would you also, thinking about climate change, go into other habitats, other areas, more coastal, more terrestrial perhaps?
Possibly. My first love is really coral reefs, and it feels like an endless muse for me. It's so cool to think about how there's this kind of like alien universe in our backyards that so few of us ever get to see or appreciate. And it's becoming even harder every day to see really healthy coral reefs in the wild. And so I want to celebrate that as hard as I can while they still exist.
I think that's a great ambition. I went to Raja Ampat 2 years ago and
Oh yeah.
absolutely loved those reefs. They're incredible.
Yeah, that's like heaven. That's my happy place that I
Yes.
think about when I'm stressed.
Not surprised.
Thanks.
There was another question in the chat. So your work has taken you to many countries with diverse cultures and life experiences, and that are often most threatened by climate change. I'm curious as to your process for immersing yourself in these communities, getting a sense for their culture, their lives, and bringing that into your work / the workshops you have with them.
I think that's such an important part of understanding how to inspire climate change with my work. I mean, inspire solutions to climate change and other conservation issues with my work, because I feel like connecting with community is the only way to make it personal, and people are only going to change their habits and their lifestyle choices and the impacts they have on the environment if they think it affects them personally and emotionally and in a way that is kind of fun, like benefiting them personally also. And I think that sense of hope and kind of benefit is really important, as selfish as that sounds. And I think that I want to do more of that, connecting to different communities. And so I hope that I'll be able to have the opportunity to travel to more countries and do kind of similar workshops and cultural exchanges. I've really mostly done that in Indonesia and the US so far. And so I feel like I have a lot more branching out to do. But in Indonesia, it was a really natural process because the Coral Triangle Center was so welcoming and wanted me to really understand how life is in not only Bali, which is unique in Indonesia, but like in the country as a whole, because its priorities are different, politics work differently, the priorities in terms of what people derive in terms of benefits from the ocean are different, and people don't have as huge of carbon footprints as we do in the US. And so I think understanding how people's lifestyles affect climate change outside of our own kind of bubble is really important too.
Here's another question. Have you observed COVID having an impact on the reach of your work? Since your work is so tactile, just curious how you've personally adapted to the cancellation of installations or not being able to host in-person workshops.
You know, it's really interesting because I usually work alone in my studio. So I'm an introvert. I'm usually totally isolated in here, just sort of sitting like a coral, building my work. And then I was traveling a lot before COVID, but it was still pretty limited. Like I was doing workshops in Indonesia and Bali when I could, but I didn't have as much of a reach online. And so I actually feel like I've been more connected to people around the world in different places since COVID started. And I've had an opportunity to kind of branch out and learn how to share my work online and through images and video in a way that I didn't even really try to do before. So I feel more connected. I think in terms of having those personal connections and really being able to meet people and get to know kind of how they experience these conservation issues and solutions has been limiting, but I don't know, there's a whole silver lining to this thing that feels way more connected.
I had a question also, while others think of theirs. How do you balance scientific accuracy with artistic creativity?
That's a good question. I don't try to be too realistic. I've studied a lot of coral taxonomy and I've done a ton of field work, and I can usually recognize at least corals down to kind of at least the family level, sometimes down to genus and species, but I don't necessarily think about that too specifically when I'm creating my work. I use a lot of artistic license, and I often feel like I'm creating kind of hybrid species or fantastical combinations of different forms. And then I'll go scuba diving and see something that looks even zanier. So the ocean is more creative than I'll ever be. But I think that it's more important in my work. My goal is really to evoke the feeling that I have when I'm scuba diving over a healthy reef and kind of hovering over and finding details in every angle. And so that's why I put a lot of my work on the wall, because I want viewers to feel like they're kind of hovering over the reef in the same way, kind of discovering it for themselves. So, yeah. I think if I were making like natural history dioramas, it would feel a lot more academic and maybe not evoke the same kind of sense of wonder that I'm trying to get across. So that's why I don't put too much emphasis on that stuff.
And are there any projects that you're working on right now or things leading to the future?
Yeah, so I've got a project that I'm doing for, I think I mentioned the Seabird Resort down near San Diego. So I'm making a work that's going to be kind of over the reception desk. And we're installing that later this month. So I'm excited for that. I'm also doing a project for the new environmental studies building at a college called Wofford College in South Carolina. So I'm excited to finish that later this spring and get that installed. And yeah, so a few different projects in the works. But I have a show coming up in Cape Cod and Falmouth, Massachusetts, that's in collaboration with the Marine Biological Laboratory there, but it's being hosted by Highfield Hall and Gardens. So we're going to be opening that in mid-July. So I'm excited for that too.
I have a question about your installation that's coming up in San Diego. I live there, so I would love to go and see it. So where is it going to be exactly?
It's in Oceanside. It's called the Seabird Resort. It's a new resort that isn't open yet. I think they're opening maybe early summer or late spring, but it's pretty it's north a bit, but it's, yeah, Oceanside near Carlsbad. So
okay, well, I'll have to go and look at it when it
great.
opens.
Yes, I'm excited. I'm so glad it's finally opening. I was worried everything was going to be delayed, but
yeah, of course.
it's all on track. Yeah.
Yeah, Cameron, I agree. That would be incredible. I also live near Los Angeles, so maybe
Cool.
once I'm at home over the summer, I can take a trip down there and check it out.
Oh, that's great. Lovely.
So where are some places people can look at your work who maybe aren't based near where one of your installations are?
You mean like where else do I have work installed that people can visit or?
Yeah, and where else, like online, or what are your handles? Maybe you can drop them in the chat or something.
Sure. Yeah, I am mostly on Instagram at Courtney Coral. On Facebook, I'm Courtney Coral Art, and I have work up. I mentioned that Art Changing Seas 1, the original one, is still up in Washington, D.C. So I don't know if they're still open to the public, like with COVID and everything, but usually they were open on weekdays. In downtown DC, it's 12th and H Streets Northwest, I believe, but you should look that up. I also did a commission for the Nova Southeastern University Oceanographic Center in South Florida. So they have a research facility it's kind of near Hollywood, Florida, in Dania Beach. So I have a work in the lobby there that I didn't include in my talk, but that one is there. And if you're ever in Indonesia, you can try to get permission. It's unfortunate because the embassy in Jakarta is pretty tight security. So the work that I have there is actually behind some Homeland Security gates. So you have to have like a special tour or something to get in there. But the Coral Triangle Center in Bali is usually open to the public. So that's a good one to try to visit if you ever make it out to Bali.
I have one more quick question. I just unmute myself. So I'm just curious because you had mentioned some of I think when people think of corals, their first thought is like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I mean, you had mentioned that corals are found very vibrant and alive in a lot of other places near smaller island nations, perhaps. And I'm just curious in your communications, in your strategy, how you kind of go about, I guess, making apparent the fact that corals are not just found in Australia, and that they're found in these other countries that people may overlook, or that are often overlooked in other environmental spaces or with regard to climate change.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think coral reefs, like really, those coral reefs that you see in nature documentaries, the really shallow, beautiful, colorful ones, are mostly in the tropics. There are some in the subtropics. And there are, so many equatorial countries that derive so much benefit from reefs. So I think it is important to kind of emphasize that. I think the Great Barrier Reef gets so much attention because it's the biggest and kind of the best publicized probably, but that's just one example. And I think it's been a really good example for the threat of climate change because they have studied it so intensely, and there was so much bleaching, unfortunately, that happened on the Great Barrier Reef, especially in the northern part. Back in 2016, there was a huge bleaching event that was all around the world. It was affecting places in Samoa and like the Maldives, like all over the place. But the Great Barrier Reef was really the one making the headlines because that is just something that is known around the world as being kind of a national treasure or a world treasure. And like 93% of the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef bleached in the course of a couple months. And that was actually when I was in Australia diving with my husband in that kind of scene that we referenced in the video. It just happened to be exactly when we were out there trying to go scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef and saw all that bleaching. In places like the Coral Triangle, I mean, that's such a gigantic region, so it's hard to generalize, but the reefs around Indonesia and in that region are so diverse, and that diversity makes them really resilient to a lot of the threats that have impacted other places. Like in the Caribbean, a lot of the reefs have died off and they were never quite as diverse, so they never had as much resilience to threats. So it's interesting ecologically to kind of understand how that diversity creates like redundancy in different species that can help protect the reef from completely dying every time there's a huge threat impacting it. That sort of answered your question.
So how did you learn how to unite art and science for political change? Because I feel like for, a lot of people, especially when I was in high school, art and science seemed very separated. And so how did you learn to mesh them together? And how do you hope that other people, start to see it that way as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I discovered that combination when I was in college. I think I first started sculpting corals out of clay when I was in high school. And it was this really kind of eccentric thing that I decided to do because I started studying marine biology for the first time and I was already taking ceramics and I kind of was just like maybe a three-dimensional learner. So I felt like I could understand what I was studying better if I sculpted it. And then that just completely snowballed into basically what I wanted to do when I grow up. So in college, I did a self-determined major. So my major advisor was in the biology department at Skidmore, but she encouraged me to take art classes. And once I realized I could actually have this opportunity to do kind of an interdisciplinary major, I really jumped at that opportunity. So I crafted my own curriculum that ended up being essentially a full biology major plus all the sculpture and ceramics classes that I wanted to take. And so from the very beginning, I wanted to combine art and science, and I felt like the combination was greater than the sum of its parts. I felt like I could have a much stronger voice if I translated the science into art and used art to kind of inspire the research I was doing. At the time, I didn't know if I should become a marine researcher and do art as a hobby, or if I could actually make a career like mine work. And I feel really fortunate that I had enough mentors and my supportive parents and all kinds of people that actually, didn't try to get me to be more practical. Because I think one of the biggest challenges in becoming an artist in general, but like definitely an artist with such a specific focus, is that you could just be kind of discouraged at any point and decide to become more practical and give up. So I feel really lucky that I haven't had to do that and that it's kind of grown into this career that I love so much. I feel really lucky.
How have scientists reacted to your work? Because you have allowed the creativity to take over in beautiful ways.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you find their response when the accuracy sometimes is not there?
A lot of them will try to look for the accuracy. I think it's kind of funny because they'll be like, oh, I recognize that species of sponge. And I'll be like, oh, really? What is it? I don't know. Or, I mean, it's funny because I kind of speak the language. So we can talk very technically about certain types of corals and how like that sponge may not actually interact with the species of coral or whatever on a natural reef. But I think it's way more fun to be less technical about it. And most of the scientists that I have really talked to about this kind of thing are much more easygoing about it. I think a lot of scientists are artistic, and I've met a lot of especially biologists who do their own illustrations or who do a lot of underwater photography and get really creative in that regard. And I think a lot of people who care deeply about conservation really understand that creativity is at the heart of that, and that you really have to get people to care and personally connect before they'll actually act. So I think it's an interesting conversation always. I think more than anything, the scientists will immediately relate to the work, and some art people will be concerned that it's like a little bit too literal or something. So that's something, like, I feel way more of an outsider in the art world than the science world.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Kind of funny. Less so now, like I'm getting a little more comfortable, but
Yeah.
that's been harder.
Well, I think we've just about reached the end of our time, but thank you to everyone who came and asked questions. And thank you so much, Courtney, Mattison, for giving us some of your time, showing us your work. This has been really incredible. I've never seen anything like your work, so this has been really amazing for me. So thank you so much. And then to everyone here, please continue to visit the Enviro-Art Gallery website and check out some of the other speakers coming up this week. And Courtney Mattison's talk will be available on our website soon after the end of this call.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you.